Joining us now is Holly Dagres. She's a Cairo-based Middle East analyst and commentator. Holly, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Doing very well.
Good.
It's great to have you on. I know we've spoken before on the Aslan Media podcast and
Hmm.
elsewhere as well. And I wanted to start. Obviously last week the sort of big news was that President Obama was moving forward with airstrikes against ISIS as really the 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 scope of what ISIS was doing and the threat to the Yazidi community, and what really does seem to actually be genocidal intentions, uh, became more clear. And as we, just situate this conversation, and I know you as someone who's obviously
Hmm.
very thoughtful about the use of U.S. power abroad, very critical. But it seems to me that this is one of these situations where I don't know from a security and humanitarian point of view how we step back from this. And that's my instinct. So I want to know what your instinct is and what you think of really the utility, I guess, of these airstrikes as well.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I'm kind of not a fan of U.S. intervention, and so it was really hard for me to actually be kind of, I guess you could say, fine with this because of what's going on. Basically, it's borderline genocide. I mean, today the Telegraph was reporting that when they were dropping the humanitarian aid up to Mount Sanjar, that it basically the journalist said it is Death Valley. Up to 70% of them are dead. And as you know, this is an ancient religion, the Yazidis, and
Yeah.
it's a cross between Zoroastrianism and Mitrism. And ISIS sees them as devil worshippers, and they feel that they should be slaughtered, all of them. And I mean, as we see, the other day they were reporting that 500 women and children were buried alive. I mean,
Yeah.
this is just sick. It's disgusting.
Yes.
And I mean, it's hard to sit back and be okay with it happening. And I mean, and as I feel like it's anybody I've spoken to has been actually happy that the U.S. is targeting ISIS, whereas a lot of these people weren't for certain interventions in the past, myself included. So it's like I think it's just another level of evil. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, Al Qaeda describes them as being that they're so extreme that they don't want to deal with them is what Al Qaeda said.
Right.
So I mean, and it's if and I think that the reason these airstrikes might not do well, I mean, they'll stop them to an extent. But the problem is that if we hadn't started this, they would have gone after other minorities as well. I mean, this is just the beginning. I mean, the Christians did get away from a lot of it, but they were still going to go after the Shias and anybody that they could get their hands on. And I think that it was better we started it now than later, even though some of the refugees have been claiming that it's too little too late. But I mean, I think if we had totally ignored it, we would have had a bigger issue at hand.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah. No, I think you're right, and I think that what's interesting about this is Iraq. We were discussing this on the show the other day that this is now President Obama is the fourth U.S. president in a row to engage militarily against Iraq. And you can even see different strains of our foreign policy in all of these interventions. So, the Gulf War, the
Hmm.
first President Bush, did generate a global coalition to do it. There was limited goals, and in fact, not only were there limited goals, it was actually a great portrayal of the Kurds as an example when we called on them to rise up and then didn't provide them with any backing, and then they were massacred again by the
Hmm.
Saddam Hussein regime. Then President Clinton would sort of periodically lob bombs at Iraq, and then sort of implemented this really obscene and brutal sanctions regime. And then, of course, we have the neoconservative fantasy on Iraq. And now it seems like with President Obama, like, is the analogy now more like Rwanda, like a hybrid of like stopping another Rwanda, and also again just thinking really seriously that maybe as terrorism has become so cheapened as an issue because people don't talk about it and think about it seriously, and it's been used to justify so many stupid policies and so many foreign
Mhm.
policy wrongs. But there is this group that really does want to literally eliminate. They want I keep thinking of these analogies. It's almost like the Khmer Rouge or something. And there's
Oh,
that,
essentially, yeah.
yeah. Go ahead.
No, I think you're right about that. And I mean, this need to intervene in Iraq. I mean, I think I watched your interview the other day. You guys were talking about why not Syria, but why Iraq? And I
Right.
think that I mean, when it boils down to, we've been intervening in Iraq, like you said, for like several decades. I mean, we were in there for at least, what was it, 10 years,
Yeah.
and we're on the ground, so it's so much easier for us to go in and out of Iraq. We know the terrain. We're essentially the reason why things are happening there. I mean, we put a democratic government supposedly, and then somebody who, I mean, unfortunately, if Maliki was more willing to reach out to the Sunnis, I feel like this wouldn't be happening right
Right.
now. And I think we just didn't do a good job. It's not a matter of an exit strategy. It's a matter of the government we helped place there. You know,
Hmm.
having soldiers there or not is not the issue. I know a lot of people have been discussing that recently. I think what it really boils down to is us reaching out to Maliki and being like, "Listen, buddy, you need to step down, and we need to figure this out, because if it wasn't for the fact, I mean, the Shias were marginalized under Saddam Hussein, and it wasn't until the Iraq War that they actually got a place in government and whatnot, and it was because of that they started marginalizing the Sunnis. And then, of course, as we saw, it made it easier for the Sunni tribes to take arms with ISIS, because they're like, oh, this will help us in the long run. And sure enough, they're already regretting it. And it hasn't even been that long, because they're destroying their historical sites and whatnot. But, I mean, I feel like with ISIS, I don't think these airstrikes are going to take them out, or per se, but I think it's a start. And I think that we really need to accept the fact that a lot of these jihadi movements are going to come and go in waves. I mean, the fact that Al Qaeda is so not important to us right now, it's fascinating. But I mean, ISIS, even if they stop with Iraq or Syria, they'll find another target. Though, I
Hmm.
mean, it's very likely they'll start attacking American areas in the Middle East, like the military bases and whatnot. We might see similar things to what happened in Yemen with the USS
Right.
Cole. And I mean, I don't necessarily think they'll go as far as to the United States, but I mean, who knows? And that's the kind of scary thing about it. And I feel like with the Obama administration, as you know, Samantha Power, she's a big humanitarian hawk, and she's written a book about America in the Age of Genocide, and
Right.
she's done extensive research on some of the biggest genocides in the 20th century, in the 21st, including Sudan, Rwanda, Cambodia, and whatnot. And she was always very critical of the U.S. not intervening. So she was the one that pushed for Libya.
Right.
I think she also was pushing for Syria to an extent, but of course we already knew what happened with that. And I feel like she was definitely the one pushing for the current situation in Iraq. So
Yeah,
I
that
think
makes total
that,
sense to me. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
No, so then that sort of, I mean, the two other pieces I think we need to get to, and I really want your insight on then is, so I think that that is the fundamental thing that you obviously have this group, ISIS, ISIS, ISIL, whatever. I guess the term is still in dispute, but that are incredibly violent, incredibly
Mhm.
opportunistic, and hold. I do think that I like the Khmer Rouge analogy makes sense to me because of this notion of like everybody who doesn't fit a certain very limited category needs to be entirely eliminated to create this fantasy state that they've built in their head, and it's
Mhm.
incredibly brutal. But so that is a thing in and of itself, and it's a force and a threat. But I agree with you that there wouldn't have been an opening for it if there weren't enough Sunni that just said, okay, well, maybe we will collaborate with them on a one-off, or maybe we will accept this on some level because the Shia government is just focused on getting kind of retribution from the Saddam era, and we don't have a
Mhm.
voice. So, you know, we'll get to the Kurds in a moment, but I mean, basically, while this is happening, palace politics are happening in Baghdad. Maliki is looking like he's making moves to have a coup, basically, to keep himself in power, even as he's
Hmm.
losing support from his own Shia constituencies. And the Kurds, who are holding this together for everybody, are saying, dude, you need to leave. So,
Hmm. Yeah.
that, like, how does that fit together? While, like, it's almost like, not only is Rome burning, it's like Rome is burning, but they're having they're doing palace intrigue in the Senate while it's burning.
Yeah, no, it's so frustrating because I feel like if Maliki would step down, a lot of things would be different. And I think
Hmm.
he's being really greedy and selfish and just power hungry. And I think in order for this to move forward, like theoretically speaking, if Maliki was to step down, I think what Iraq needs, but again, given the situation at hand, it's kind of hard to have a proper government to stand and actually do anything in parliament, as we've been seeing in the past few weeks. They can't even get together anymore.
Right.
But I think if Iraq really wants to move forward with this, because no matter what, we got to accept the fact that there's a lot of minority groups there. And I think that the closest comparison would be to Lebanon's
Hmm.
government. I think they need to divide the powers between the religious groups.
Hmm.
Like Lebanon has their president's Maronite Christian, their Speaker of the Parliament Shia, their Prime Minister Sunni,
Right.
and that's just how it is. And I don't know what exactly order of that would work in Iraq, but I think that's definitely the way to go. And I think Maliki needs to step down for starters, and then hopefully somebody would implement a similar system of governance. Because the problem here is that Saddam, as much Saddam kept everybody in their place.
Right.
He was a brutal dictator, but everybody feared him, and nobody stepped out of line with him. But now, because of democracy and whatnot, we have all these people that want a place in government. They were fighting for power, and I mean that's completely fine. They should be entitled to, but I think it should be equal, and I think that's why they need to adopt this Lebanese form of government in Iraq. Now, who's going to help do that? I mean, I hate to put America in this, but I feel like we're kind of obligated given that we were the ones that toppled Saddam and had been there for a good decade. But that doesn't mean, again, let me reiterate, troops on the ground necessarily. I think we need some of our top diplomats in there talking to Maliki. And I think actually even better is that we need to talk to Iran. Iran can tell Maliki to step down. And I think if we get our best American diplomats to reach out to Iran and be like, listen, you guys are the closest to him, and I think you know that this is important that we keep Iraq stable, and you guys need to tell him to step down, and this is what our plan, and we'd really appreciate your help. We need to stop ignoring the fact that Iran is a regional power, and I think by doing so, I think that will help the situation in Iraq immensely. So I
Not only a
really think
regional
it
power, but
boils to that.
yeah, I mean, not only a
Yeah,
regional power, but just, I mean, with all of its own problems, just objectively one of the more stable forces in the region right now. I mean, as a final
definitely.
question too, I mean, it also seems like the other thing that really needs to be recalibrated, and it already has to a certain extent, but that, you know, this Kurdish fighting force, the
Hmm.
Peshmerga is what is holding them back right now. That's who our airstrikes are supporting. There's even this report of Kurdish rebels actually helping rescue a group of Yazidi. It seems like another just sort of fundamental rethink, and it looks like it is happening that the CIA is starting to ship serious weapons in to back the Kurds. But like
Hmm.
this sort of residual consequence of Middle East foreign policy of, placating Turkey on Kurds and, all of this sort of tension around Kurdish national aspirations, it really just needs to be
Yeah.
dropped now because the Kurds are like, they're the ones, if we don't want to stop this force and we also want any type of faction that, you know, has some type of sort of respect for human rights or it's them. So like, when do we drop all of this old stuff with the Kurds as well, in addition to Iran?
I think the Kurdish topic, as you said, is very sensitive, and I think to an extent, yes, they're better organized, and even they're part of Iraq. It's just a totally different
Right.
appearance and whatnot, and they're just holding together very well. What I fear is that if we arm everybody all the time. Like,
Right.
we don't need to go into the history of that, but it's never really turned out really well. The arms end up in other people's hands. Things get a little dicey or too dicey. I think what worries me is that if, let's say, ISIS gets obliterated somehow or another, or something happens to them. I'm worried that, I mean, Iraq is basically in a civil war already, but I'm worried that it'll become Sunni Shia versus Kurd,
Mm.
and there'll be a big fight over this Kurdish state issue. And then you've got the Kurds in Turkey and Iran. I think it could get bigger than what we think. I'm not saying that I'm against a Kurdish state, but I'm just looking at the bigger picture that it would only be the start of a bigger issue. I mean, South Sudan's a proper example of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And again, every country's a different story, but I mean, the
No.
big picture, it sounds good in theory right now, and I just feel like that we need to treat every side equally, if that makes sense, because in the end, that's the only way that's going to keep Iraq together. If we start dividing it up into three parts, it's just not going to sustain itself, and I feel like that'll become an even longer and more complicated process in the long run, if that makes sense to you.
It does make sense. I do think that regardless of the national aspirations, which I totally agree with you, do bring up a lot of questions, that they are the ones that even right now, from the perspective of any type of Iraqi national unity, they're the ones who are sort of showing up for it right now. And that seems to be
Mhm.
like the only kind of path that I could see, because I also think that, and we've talked about this before, that these things also, of course, they fundamentally need to come from the place itself, and it can't be imposed from outside. And if we have this really threatening, horrific group, vulnerable minorities, and then we have Maliki with his own selfishness, as you say, and it seems like the Kurds at this point are the faction that is actually, I mean, obviously fighting for themselves, but really in effect fighting for the whole country. But I
Yeah,
agree with
no,
you
very
about the
true.
longer term questions. But as always, Holly Dagres, I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I know
Thank you for having me.
it was great. We'll chat soon. Thanks so much.